Hey, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, الذي من علينا بالفقه في الدين ويسر لنا سلوك السبيل المهتدين وصلى الله على نبيه المختار خاتم الأنبياء وقدوة الأصفياء وعلى آله سادة الأطهار أصحاب الكرام الذين هم هداية المختار. Assalamu alaikum. Allah, such enthusiasm. I love it. So I'm assuming you guys already know what the sort of structure of these talks is going to be, yes? Who are we going to be covering today? One person knows. Okay. Who's next? No. Salahuddin. Who's next? No. Somebody else. Abdul Hamid. A second. Yeah. No, you're right. Aurangzeb is next. I don't know. I thought he was lost. Okay. So before we start, I need to make a note. Okay. These personalities were not perfect. They are not anbiya, so they're not infallible. Okay. They had mistakes, and sometimes we will mention their mistakes. As Muslims, you have to understand we don't have this weird, especially some people do, this weird sort of hatred or this arrogance when looking back in the past. You know, they say hindsight is 20/20, so just keep that in mind. These people lived at times where they're undergoing things that we cannot imagine, so they had to make decisions. Sometimes those decisions were good, sometimes they were bad. Okay, this is especially important to note with the latter two, Aurangzeb and Abdul Hamid. With the earlier two, there's not really too much bad that's been mentioned. But with the later two, there is, some things that we need to clarify and some things that we need to understand. Okay, so I've started with this ayah for this reason. Allah Azza wa Jal tells you to make a dua. Part of that dua is so that you don't hate or you don't look down upon those people who preceded you in Iman. And one thing you're going to learn is that these people have been hand-chosen by me. I tend to love history. So I've chosen these 4 people for a purpose. Each of these people had a very interesting and amazing legacy, to the point where it affected not just generations after them, but people to this day. Each of them. You're going to see Ibn Abdul-Aziz's legacy today. Next week, next week, inshallah, you'll see Salahuddin. The week after, you'll see Aurangzeb. And then finally, you'll see Abdul Hamid. So before I actually start, I just want to ask very quickly, who's familiar with Umar ibn Abd? This is a very difficult name for me to say. I don't know why I chose to present him. Who's familiar? Raise your hand. Okay, you guys are raising your hand like this. I can see your faces. Raise it a little higher than your faces. Can you raise it higher than your face? Okay, so 1, 2. Okay, no sisters. I know you guys did this. I'm not going to count it. Okay. How many of you guys are familiar with Salahuddin? Okay, now the hands went up quickly. Good. Who is familiar with Aurangzeb? This is a very pleasant surprise. So 5 people roughly. And Abdul Hamid. Okay, I'm assuming that Turkish series helped with that. Okay, but good. The idea behind these talks is I'm not going to go through their extensive biography. We're going to touch upon a few things while giving you some background information, inshallah, okay? So without further ado, let's start with the first. Umar ibn Abd. This, honestly, when you read about him, you feel like you're reading about the Sahaba. His legacy was like that of the Sahaba, to the point where even the Sahaba who were around him praised him. He was a person that the scholars used to go to, and this is something that's been mentioned. If he wasn't a Khalifa, and if he wasn't a governor, he would be remembered as a scholar. And we'll discuss his scholarly legacy as well. But this is a very important person who's come in Islam. And the reason is because he was a mujaddid. How many of you guys are familiar with what a mujaddid is? Raise your hand. You guys are killing me. Just raise your hand high for once. Okay, you're still not raising it high. Neither are you. Okay, you're doing whatever this is. Okay, no problem. The Rasul ﷺ told us that every 100 years, there's going to be someone who comes who revives this deen. Meaning, if you're imagining this deen as a ship sailing along the river, sometimes it'll look like it's going and it's going to hit the bank. But no, there's going to come someone who takes the wheel and re-guides it to the center and it keeps going. Every 100 years, you're going to see someone like that. There's pretty much a consensus, an ijma', meaning everyone agrees that the first mujaddid Islam saw was Ibn Abdul-Aziz. Now, as a mujaddid, as a reviver of this deen, he's very, very unique. Because when you look at the other revivers who've come in the past, you have to understand no one really has consensus except for Ibn Abdul-Aziz and maybe Imam al-Shafi'i, maybe. But those who come later, they don't have consensus. And usually their tajdeed or their revival is very limited. I'll give you an example. When we talk about Aurangzeb, I'm going to mention a scholar by the name of Ahmed Sirhindi. Ahmed Sirhindi, literally he's called in historical circles that are South Asian focused, Mujaddid al-Thani, or al-Thani, okay? That he's the Mujaddid of the second Alf is 1,000, second century? No, second millennium or whatever era. His tajdeed was only in scholarship. He wasn't as a Khalifa, he wasn't a politician, a governor. His tajdeed was being a scholar. You go and you see Imam al-Shafi'i, again, he's not involved in politics, he's only a scholar. His contribution is as a scholar. Then you come to Ibn Abdul Aziz. Then you come to Umar. His tajdeed is not only as a scholar, but it's also as a Khalifa, which is something that is unheard of. Meaning you can have one or the other, but it's very hard to find them both in one. Like Abdul Hamid, if we consider him a Mujaddid, which many people do, he had the political part of it. He had the part of being a Sultan / Khalifa. He didn't have the scholarship part. So for this reason, Ibn Abdul Aziz is very, very, very unique. You see that as a Mujaddid, as a reviver, there are three things that were amazing. Is there a bird in here? There are three things about him that were amazing. One is his political activity as a governor and as a Khalifa. The other thing is as a patron to scholarship, meaning someone who supports scholarship, as well as being a scholar himself. And then the final thing is his taqwa, his personal piety and his zuhud. You guys know what zuhud is? Yes, no? Raise your hand if you do. Okay. Zuhud is like this quality of people that makes them abstain from the dunya, allows them to abstain from the pleasures of the worldly life very, very easily. Okay, it's called zuhud. Some people call it asceticism. Some people don't like calling it asceticism, but it's decent for our purposes here. Okay. Now, what did people say about Umar? See, I'm trying to give you a taste of who he was. Now, each of these quotes, again, I've hand selected because the people saying these quotes are huge personalities. Okay, so first we start with Muhammad ibn Sirin. Raise your hand if you know who that is. Okay, one person, two people. Three people. Muhammad ibn Sirin. He was one of the early scholars amongst the Tabi'een, the generation after the Sahaba. One of the things he was known for is being very tough. It's hard for Ibn Sirin to pay you a compliment, basically, because he was a very critical person. So he comes and he says that Umar ibn Abd Aziz was the Imam of guidance. Somebody comes and asks him, and this is part of his scholarship, Ibn Abd Aziz's scholarship. Someone comes to Ibn Sirin and he asks him about a particular issue in fiqh. Ibn Sirin responds with what's on the screen, that the Imam of guidance forbade it. The Imam of guidance forbade it. Ibn Sirin calling somebody Imam of guidance or praising somebody is a big deal. If you look at the science of hadith, there's a thing where it's called Jarh and Ta'dil. There are scholars whose purpose, whose life's mission was to analyze narrators. And in order to do that, they would have to criticize them. So their entire life's mission was saying, this narrator is bad, don't take from him. Don't take hadith from him. This narrator is good, you can take from him. Ibn Sirin was one of the types of critics that was really harsh. Like he would say something, he would completely obliterate the person. Okay? So Ibn Sirin saying this about Ibn Abdul Aziz is a very big deal. The next person is Malik ibn Dinar. Okay? Malik ibn Dinar was, raise your hand if you know who that is. Okay. Malik ibn Dinar is a huge scholar in two things, hadith and in tasawwuf / tazkiyah. Malik ibn Dinar was known for being ascetic. He's known for being a zahid. He's known for being like a super down-to-earth person, did not care about the dunya at all. To the point where if you look at like Sufi scholars who come much later than him, meaning like the Sufi tariqas or their paths, schools, whatever you want to call it, a lot of them tend to really look up to Malik ibn Dinar for good reason. And Malik ibn Dinar, what does he say about Ibn Abdul Aziz? He says, specifically the report, he actually says, I heard people talking about me and they're saying I'm a Zahid. And he says, no. The only Zahid is Ibn Abdul Aziz, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Him saying this is huge. This is one of the Imams of Zuhud, saying that Ibn Abdul Aziz is the only Zahid. He's negating the attribute for himself and affirming it for Ibn Abd al-Aziz. And finally, we come to Imam Ahmad. Please, if you know him, raise your hand. Imam Ahmad's virtues cannot be, it can't be spoken like within a week, within a month, within a year. Imam Ahmad was the fourth of the four Imams. You know, one of the things that was pitched to me was to cover the four Imams. I said no. Everyone knows, the majority of people know the four Imams, but these four personalities that we've chosen, not a lot of people know about them. Imam Ahmad was the final of them. I don't know where to begin with him. This man was tortured and punished by the Khalifa, okay, during his time, an oppressive Khalifa. He never relented. He was tortured and punished repeatedly in front of everyone. The other Imams around him, many of them just gave in. Some of them even, like, they went as far, like they did taqiyya, they lied. They just relented. They said what the Khalifa wanted them to say. Ibn Hanbal didn't do that. Even though it was permissible for him to just lie and get out of the torture, he didn't do that. He stood his ground. What he says is, if you see any man who loves Umar, radiallahu anhu, by the way, you can say for other than Sahaba as well. If anyone loves Umar and he mentions him in goodness, then know that this person, you can expect good from him. Meaning, a sign of somebody being a good person is their love for this man. Again, this is very rare. Imam Ahmad was also a very strict and very stern person. Actually, some of his friends were stricter and sterner, but he was also himself very, very strict and stern. Him praising people was not the most common thing. In fact, you can count in very few number how many people he's actually really praised. Ibn al-Aziz is one of them, al-Shafi'i is another. And there's a few others. But this is what you need to know. Ibn Abd al-Aziz is a personality that was loved during his time, and he was loved after his time. And he was loved during his time. When we say during his time, look at his time. You're talking about the children of the Sahaba and their children. You're talking about the best of generations, and they agree upon the fact that they love him. Like there's ijma', there's consensus that we love this person. So let's talk about his early life and upbringing. And again, we're not trying to do a full biography of the person. If you want, you can do it on YouTube. Biographies are generally pretty boring in my opinion. So let's start with a little story. Okay? During the Khilafah of Umar, radiallahu anhu, meaning Ibn Khattab, okay, he was walking around patrolling the streets of Medina. He hears a conversation inside a house. A woman is speaking to her daughter, and she's saying, add water to the milk. Umar stops because he hears a crying. You see, they're adding water to the milk so they can sell it just as pure milk and get a profit. Okay. The daughter refuses. She says no, because the Khalifa forbade it. The mother responds saying, okay, but he's not here. He can't see you. He can't hear you. She obviously did not know he actually could hear her. But then the daughter responds with something amazing. She says, even if he can't hear me or see me, Allah can hear me and see me. Umar radiallahu anh, he heard this and he was walking with Aslam. Aslam was his servant. Aslam himself is a personality to study. He was walking with his servant Aslam, and he's like, Aslam, mark this house, we're going to come back. He goes back home and he goes to his sons and he's like, which one of you guys wants a wife? Now, obviously, like, he knows which son's married, and maybe it's a second wife or third wife, who knows? But he asked his son, which one wants a wife? One of them steps forward, okay? And that was, blanking on his name, Asim. Asim steps forward, is one of his sons. He goes the next day and proposes with Asim to the family, and they get married. Asim and his wife, we don't know the name of the woman, unfortunately. They have children. They have somebody by the name of Layla. Okay? Layla marries somebody. Layla and that somebody have a child. That child is Umar ibn Abd. You can see, first of all, his descendant, his lineage is very nice. He leads right up to Umar radiallahu anh. And he's named after him. That's why his name is Umar. Not only that, his grandmother, his grandmother was a very pious person. His grandfather was also a very pious person. His mother was also a very pious person. And his father, we'll speak about his father very briefly. You see, I need to give you some historical background. If I have time. I think I have time. Umar ibn Abd was the Khalifa during the Umayyad period. If you know about Islamic history, you know that our history early on we saw the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam come first as the leader of the state. Then comes the Khulafa al-Rashideen, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Hassan. Then comes Banu Umayyah, okay, which is Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and his descendants basically. The issue comes with the fact that Banu Umayyah or the Umayyads were really bad. Better than what we have now, but that's a different story. They were bad, they were oppressive. And to give you a picture of that, actually, I think I can just mention two things. Umayyads were responsible for the murder of Hussein radiallahu anh, the grandson of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Umayyads were responsible for the murder of Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu anh. Umayyads were responsible for killing a lot of Ahlul Bayt, a lot of the family of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you look at history, you see Ahlul Bayt constantly arising in rebellion. And that's fine, by the way. Abu Hanifa supported their rebellion, just so you know. Umayyads did not have a good track record. They were known to be oppressive. Okay? His father, al-Aziz ibn Marwan, was surprisingly good. He's one of the few Umayyads that was actually very good. One of the things that made him very good is that he actually studied with the Sahaba. He studied with Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh. He kept company with scholars, and he was very cautious about ill dealings. Unlike other Umayyad governors and leaders. MashaAllah, look who decided to show up. I guess you guys as well. Is this the MSA team? The MSA team is coming late, guys. I just mentioned, by the way, that rebellion is fine. If you guys want to stage a rebellion, I'll help you. I'm the former president, I have still some political experience here. But his father was a very good person. So you can already see he's coming from a very noble house. By the way, people understood that he was coming from a noble house. And frankly, I didn't, if it was possible, I would have included more praises of him from other people. But one of the people that does praise him quite a bit is Ali ibn Hussein. Ali ibn Hussein. Do you guys know who Ali ibn Hussein is? No? You probably know him as Zainul Abidin. He was the grandson. Yes, he's the grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, and the son of Hussein. That's right, Ali ibn Hussein. Ali ibn Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib. He also praises Umar. Okay, we don't need to mention what he said, but he praises him and his family. Okay, I don't need to mention more. Zain al-Abidin was a special person. He was known to cry a lot. Like if you go up to him and just mention ayah, he's going to burst into tears. Okay, now let's get to some slightly boring things. He's born in 63 Hijri. Okay, Hijri meaning 63 years after the Hijrah of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the Sahaba. His father was a governor in Egypt. He was actually born in Medina, by the way. He was born in Medina, but there was a lot of unrest, especially because Hajjaj. You guys know Hajjaj? Oh man, there's so many names that keep coming up. Hajjaj was a tyrant. If you look at Banu Umayyah and the Umayyads, and you look at who was the worst of them, you'll find two names. Okay, Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi and Yazid bin Muawiyah. Okay, to the point where people used to curse them. Okay, I'm going on tangents, but I'll mention one thing. Hassan al-Basri, one of the great scholars of the Tabi'een, when he heard Hajjaj had died, he did sajda, and he thanked Allah for it. Okay, that's how bad this person was. He went around killing Muslims left, right, and center, and Hajjaj is actually the one who killed Abdullah ibn Zubayr, the Sahabi, radiallahu anh, by crucifying him. Not only did he crucify him, he called out Asma, his mother. Who's Asma? Asma bint Abi Bakr. He calls Asma bint Abi Bakr and says, "Can you hear your son?" She was blind. Like, "Can you hear your son screaming and crying?" He was very messed up. Okay. I don't know how I got to this. Oh yeah, Hajjaj was wreaking havoc in the area of Hijaz, okay, in the Mecca, Medina area. So his father ended up going to Egypt and he became a governor there. So Ibn Abdul Aziz, early life he's spending in Egypt. His father had other plans for him. His father goes and sends him to Medina. And he sends him to Medina and why Medina? Aside from it being the city of the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you have to understand Medina during the, if only we could see this, subhanAllah, during the early period after the Sahaba, there's no city like this, by the way. People used to talk about the 7 fuqaha of Medina, 7 jurists of Medina. And jurists, like, we're talking about people Abu Hanifa level and Malik level. These people, 7 of them in one city. And by the way, people used to debate whether there's 7 or 10 or 12. because there's so many of these people in that city. It's hard to narrow it down, but people like the number 7. So they tried to fit everyone into 7. It didn't really work as nicely. When Ibn Abdul-Aziz goes there, first of all, there are rumors he learned from Abdullah ibn Umar, which is his like grand uncle, whatever you would call that relationship. Okay. Rumors that he learned from him. It's possible, like if he did, he only learned from him for less than like 5 years. Okay, because Abdullah ibn Umar dies very shortly after this. He did learn from Anas bin Malik though, who's a Sahabi, and he's the last really great Sahabi to live. Okay, he died 93 Hijri. And the reason I say last great is because he's really the last one who had like a prolonged companionship with the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So while in Medina as well as while in Egypt, he was studying with scholars. He's studying specifically Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah, which we'll mention in a bit. But one thing to note about him is that he lived a pretty lavish life in these times. He became a governor as well later, but we'll talk about that. He lived a lavish life. He used to spend a lot of money on perfume, a lot of money on clothes. Like people would know him by the fact that he dressed very nicely and smelled really good. Like you'd probably smell him before you saw him because he just smelled really nice. His discipleship with Ubaydullah was also very big. So I mentioned those 7 jurists of Medina. Ubaydullah was one of them. Ubaydullah was a massive scholar in hadith and fiqh. In order, like, there's no comparison I can make today. Like I was gonna say, if you go to like Mauritania and study with Sheikh Dedu or someone, that's not appropriate either. There's no comparison I can make. If somebody goes to Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah, it's a big deal. Like you're getting the top scholarship there. And ultimately this would lead to him being one of the jurists of Medina. Okay. Not one of the 7, but a jurist in Medina was very famous. Now let's go and talk about him as a governor and a khalifa. Okay, we're on decent time. As a governor, first of all, he became governor very young. He was around 20, 25 years old, between 20 and 25. How old are you? This is a weird question. I was gonna say, by show of hands, well, how old are you? Is anyone here like 23? I'm 24, so this is pretty sad. I'm not a governor. At least not yet. Unless those latecomers really spawn some rebellious instincts in some people, I'm willing to come back for the MSA and just take over a little bit. Anyways, he became governor in Medina from 86 to 93 Hijri, a pretty typical historical fact. One of the things to note is he was loved by the people. Loved. Because the thing is, like, you have to understand, he became governor shortly after Hajjaj. Hajjaj did a number on everyone in Medina. He did a number on everyone in the Ummah, really. Medina to Iraq, he was causing havoc. Umar comes in and it's such a nice like breath of fresh air. Instead of that rancid, horrible breath you were smelling earlier from Hajjaj's mouth and his soldiers. Umar comes in and he's very lenient. He's not on people, he's not attacking people, he's not doing any of that. Not only that, you have to understand Hajjaj, one of the things he did is he killed scholars. Not just for fun, the scholars rebelled against him. Amongst the scholars who rebelled against him was somebody by the name of Sa'id bin Jubair. Sa'id bin Jubair was one of the scholars of Medina and is a huge scholar. Hajjaj killed him. Okay, long story short. So when Umar comes in, the scholars are pretty happy. Not only are they happy with the fact that he's not annoying like Hajjaj was in a massacre or a tyrant like Hajjaj was, they're happy because he himself is a scholar. He's brought up in the circles of scholarship and ulum. And we're going to see a very nice example of that, specifically with Umar being corrected. Now, amongst the people, let me mention one more thing. See, whenever I speak, there's like a million tangents that come out. Very hard to restrain myself, but some tangents are worth following. The scholars are pretty much in agreement, okay, that scholars and sultans should not mix, that there should be a divide between them. This is like an agreement. To the point where Abu Hanifa said, if you see a scholar at the gate of a ruler or at the door of a ruler, question his deen, meaning be very skeptical about this person. Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, Ahmad, all of them really avoided being part of any scholarly circle. Abu Hanifa was ultimately killed because of his refusal. Malik was beaten for his refusal. Shafi was imprisoned, not really for this, but he was imprisoned regardless. And Imam Ahmad was also tortured and killed for this as well. Okay. for refusing to align with the status quo. This is generally the case. There's one exception of the Umayyads, and that's Umar. The scholars actually liked him. Az-Zuhri, who I've mentioned here, was one of the big scholars in Medina. You can come in, don't work on it. Who was one of the big scholars in Medina, Az-Zuhri. If you read books of hadith, you see his name a lot. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. His name was Muhammad al-Muslim. He died in 124 Hijri. 124, yes. 124. Az-Zuhri used to spend a lot of time with Umar. And you're going to see something I'm going to quote later. Literally next slide. Az-Zuhri was very close with him. Az-Zuhri loved, and Umar loved Az-Zuhri. Okay. Likewise, Mujahid, and this is a very interesting thing. Mujahid used to come, Mujahid, there's so many names, I feel like I need to explain them. Mujahid, he's one of the closest students of Aisha radiallahu anha. He was a scholar of a very high caliber. Mujahid used to go to Umar, and what Mujahid says is we would go to him trying to teach him something, and we would leave with him having taught us. So the scholars appreciate him, the people appreciate him. He still lived a lavish life. And again, the random point, he used to often lead Hajj. So he was pretty pious. Okay? Well, he was known to be pious. Okay, I apologize for this wall of text. I'm not going to make you read it, nor am I going to read the entire thing. But I had to quote the hadith in full. The Muwatta Imam Malik, the first hadith in it has Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz. Basically what happens is, while he was a governor in Medina, Umar delayed the prayer. Okay? He delayed Asr, to be specific. And what that means is it's not like he prayed Asr in Maghrib's time. There's a time for Asr that was considered mustahab, meaning the best time to pray it. He went outside of that. Okay, that's all he did. He's still within the time. He hasn't committed haram or anything. All he did is he did something a little less optimal. Suddenly a scholar comes to him by the name of Urwa ibn Zubair, ibn al-Awwam, one of the children of Sahaba. And he goes to him and he's like, what are you doing? Like, I heard you delayed the prayer. Don't you know that, who was it? Al-Walid? Abu Mas'ud al-Ansari, okay? No, Mughira ibn Shu'bah. When he was a governor in Kufa, Abu Mas'ud al-Ansari came to him because he did the same thing. And he's like, Ma hada ya Mughira? He's like, what is this ya Mughira? Don't you know that the Rasul or that Jibreel came down? Long story short, Jibreel prayed, the Rasul prayed, and that happened 5 times. Don't you know that? Don't you know that Jibreel came down and prayed with the Rasul at specific times? Umar responds, and now he's a governor, okay? If you go to our governors and leaders today, try to give them any advice. You're thrown in prison, you're killed. If you're lucky, you're thrown in prison, you're killed, you suddenly disappear. We've seen this in Saudi Arabia a lot, actually. Half their scholars in prison for this. Umar wasn't like that, obviously. Now, his response is, okay, wait. Know what you're narrating, Ya Urwa. Okay, know what you're narrating. Did Jibreel really establish the times of prayer for the Rasul? Okay, that's what he asked. He wants to make sure that the narration is correct. And Urwa responds that, yeah, it's correct, and he gives the sanad or the chain of narration for it. I want to point 2 things here. First thing is what I already basically said. Why didn't he just kill him? Hajjaj would have killed him, but no, Umar was a very pious person. He heard the hadith of the Rasul. He didn't react negatively. All he asked is, are you sure? He knows Urwa. Urwa knows him. Urwa is an amazing scholar himself. And he accepted it. Okay. The second thing is, this points to his scholarship. Umar is asking about the sanad of the hadith. He's asking about where the hadith come from, because he's a scholar. Okay, so I'm just giving you a picture of who he was as a jurist or as a faqih / muhaddith. He cares about evidences and he's scrupulous. As a governor, he's just and he's willing to accept advice from people. And by the way, the thing that's being advised is not a big deal. You see, all he did was delay Asr a little bit to the point where it left its time of, preferred time to pray it in. Still within Asr time, just not within the preferred time. Now, one thing I need to mention, because it is important, okay, Orientalists tend to look at this hadith and say that Umar did not know when the times of prayer was. That's wrong. As I mentioned, it has to do with the preferred times of prayer, not the specific times of when Fajr begins and Fajr ends. Also begins, whatever. Okay, just keep that as a note. Okay, as a Khalifa. This is where you start to see him resemble his great-grandfather. Who's his great-grandfather again? Umar ibn Khattab. You start to see like a stark contrast, not a contrast, a parallel between them. It's almost as if they're the same person. Okay? So Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik dies. Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, by the way, was one of the better khulafa for the Umayyads. Better, not very that amazing either. Umar is the one who's designated to lead after him. Sulaiman specifically wants Umar to lead after him. Some people really hated this. Some people wanted the Khilafah for themselves, so they tried to hide it. Long story short, Umar became the Khalifa. When he became the Khalifa, so much happened. First of all, he started crying. Okay, first thing he did actually is rejected. He goes to the Masjid Nabawi. He's like, look, I've been elected Khalifa. I don't want it. You guys choose who you want to Medina. The people of Medina, what did they do? We want you. And he's like, okay, damn. Like, I guess I'm going to be Khalifa now because the Ummah chose me. The Ummah chose him as Khalifa. He became the Khalifa. First thing he does is, of course, he leads Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik's janazah. Okay. After he leads his janazah, he gives his sort of inaugural address, and he's crying during the address. Basically, it's as if he's coming from the Sahaba. He's like, look, our pledge of allegiance is this: you obey me as long as I obey Allah. If I disobey him, disobey me. Simple as that. Then he goes home, and his wife looks at him, and he's like, you seem troubled. Like, are you well? Are you okay? Umar responds with that. No, she asked like, first what she asked is, like, are you okay? He's like, no, I've been like throwing a massive burden on me, and it's not a light burden. He actually asked, is it a light burden? And he goes on and he starts listing all the issues with it. And then she sees him start crying. She's like, are you okay? Are you well? And again, he's like, how can I be well? The burden of the ummah has been put on my neck. I have been overburdened with the naked, the hungry. And he starts mentioning the travelers, the sick, everything. He starts mentioning everyone who will have to take care of, the poor with large families. I am weeping for fear of being asked to render accounts and my possible failure to do so on the day of reckoning. Meaning he's afraid he's going to be held to account for all these people. Does that not remind you of Umar radiallahu anhu? Umar comes into power, he cries as well. Like he doesn't want it in the first place, but they give it to him. Like they force him almost. Abu Bakr basically forced. And he cries. He goes home and he starts making dua in tears. And his wife sees the same thing. And you see throughout his khilafah, he's saying things like, I'm afraid that if a sheep goes thirsty at the bank of the Nile, I'm going to be held accountable. And Umar, you see in his personality. Talking about Ibn Khattab here. Right? You see in his personality as well, like he was walking, he sees a woman who has a baby crying. He goes, investigates, finds they don't have food. The woman's like, the Khalifa doesn't care about us. She doesn't know it's Umar, like the Khalifa's in front of her. He goes to the treasury, brings her food, cooks it for her. This is how he was, and Umar ibn Abdul-Aziz followed suit. He was very much like that. Okay, we're going to see that. Now, as I mentioned, he lived a very lavish life in Medina. Okay, he moved to Syria, obviously, because that's the seat of the Umayyads. He moves to Syria. This is a strange sort of thing to think about. In Medina, generally the people were much more humble. Okay, like you would see them not dressed in super fancy clothes. While Umar is in Medina, he's dressed in super fancy clothes. He moves to Syria and he becomes the Khalifa, and Syria is the place where people are actually living lavishly. Like Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, when he ruled from a palace because the Syrians were stubborn people. They're not going to accept anyone less than an actual public ruler, in the sense that you can see the signs of rulership on him. Umar comes into Syria and he does the opposite. First thing he does is he goes to his wife and he says, this jewelry, don't be seen in public with it, go give it to the treasury. And she, mashallah, because she's herself is very pious, she gives it to the treasury, no problem. And one of the interesting things is after Ibn Abdul Aziz passes away, the person who comes next is another Khalifa, not from his progeny, but Umar's son goes to his mother and says, our father's gone. If you want the jewelry, you can wear it. And she's like, no, I'm going to stick to not wearing it because of her piety and her humbleness. The other thing is Umar was rich. He had a lot of business. Okay, gives it all to the treasury as well. Now this is very important. This is the next point. Banu Umayyah, as I said, they're very corrupt. They had many issues. Amongst the issues were that they would take from the treasury to spend on themselves, and they would start businesses and trade with the money in the treasury. They would literally just take it, public treasury, Baytul Mal. Umar goes to his relatives and he forces them to give the wealth back to the treasury. He's making his entire kin, all of Banu Umayyah, become humble, which Banu Umayyah is not used to. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, the other thing is only spending 2 dinars per day, which is very low. He used to make around like 10,000 a day from his businesses. Now he's only spending 2. The other thing is, and again, this is one of the resemblances he has to his great-grandfather, he starts wearing clothes that are very patchy, meaning clothes that are ripped up and sewn together with other cloths. This is how he used to walk around as the Caliph. And if you look at him, Ibn Abbas, Abdullah ibn Umar, one of the things he said is that this guy literally looks like my father. Like as a kid, he saw Ibn al-Aziz when he was a kid. He's like, this guy has the mark of one of the sons of al-Khattab, one of the sons of Umar, radiallahu anhu, the Sahabi. Okay. Now, in terms of his reforms, this is very important because this is where you start to see his action as a Khalifa and governor, his tajdeed. As I mentioned, Banu Umayyah corrupt. They were known to tax people like crazy. Like they introduced so many new tax and they would tax everyone, even the non-Muslims. One of the crazy things is one of their governors, they conquered a land, the people became Muslim. Because he's a weird person, I guess, he doubted their Islam, so he made them pay zakah and he made them pay jizya. So zakah is like the tax for the Muslims and jizya is the tax for non-Muslims. He made these people pay both. Because he's like, I don't know if they're sincerely Muslim, so I'm going to make them pay jizya and zakah just in case. Very crazy. He taxed the hell out of them, basically. Okay. And likewise, they would introduce like different types of land tax and all that stuff just to get a lot more money. Umar comes in, he abolishes all that. He restores it to just the regular normal land tax you have, as well as the zakah and the jizya. And that's it. And we'll talk about the effects of his reforms very soon, inshallah. This next reform is very important. Banu Umayyah, as I said, they were corrupt, not just in terms of dunya, but in terms of deen as well. One of the practices they had, which is one of the most disgusting practices ever, is that when they would do their khutbahs, you guys know what they would do? They would publicly, on the minbar of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, curse Ali radiallahu anhu. Because Banu Umayyah did not like the Alawis, or the children of Ali and his descendants, or Banu Hashim broadly. They didn't like them. The Umayyads would go on the minbar and curse Ali as part of the khutbah. Umar comes in, he abolishes that as well. And he replaces it actually with an ayah that tells you to be good to your kin. Because Banu Umayyah is related to Banu Hashim. They're from Quraysh, both of them. Okay. This is a very important reform because it's very difficult to combine Iman and hatred of Ahlul Bayt in one person. It's damn near impossible. Okay. So Umar removing this is an amazing step because what that means is that this institutionalized hatred of the family of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how weird does it feel to hear that institutionalized hatred of the family of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the Khulafa, from the leaders of the Muslims. It's crazy. And he abolished that rightfully so. Okay? And this is very important because you notice, and this is a random, interesting historical fact, the rebellions that happened on part of Ahlul Bayt, meaning Ahlul Bayt, whenever they rebelled, if you were to draw a timeline or like a map of when they rebelled, you would see, okay, the rulers of Banu Umayyah, this is Umar. You see rebellions here, Umar's faced nothing, and then after him, more rebellions. People actually liked Umar, okay, and Ahlul Bayt liked him, which is very important. The other thing is he did was inspect prisons. Okay, well, we're running out of time very quickly. I thought this would be short, subhanAllah. Again, Banu Umayyah, very corrupt. They used to treat prisoners very badly. Umar went in, he made sure that the prisoners actually had good amounts of food and proper clothing for the seasons. Okay. Giving fadak back to Ahlul Bayt was also an interesting thing. Okay. The Rasul, when he died, within his, like, what do you call it? His property was a land called Fadak. Okay. Fadak used to produce a lot of dates. It was a really nice place to farm, basically. Fatima radiallahu anha came to Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, and she basically wanted it as inheritance. So Abu Bakr said, no, the Anbiya do not leave behind inheritance, so you can't have it. And likewise, it continued like that for a while. Meaning it was handled by Ahlul Bayt, but it was not part of their property. Okay? Until Marwan comes in, one of the Umayyad Khulafa, I think he's the third or fourth. He comes in, he takes Fadak from them as his own property, which is pretty messed up. He's stealing land from Ahlul Bayt. Umar comes in, gives it back to Ahlul Bayt to maintain. Okay? Now, just as a summary, not a summary, but a conclusion, some closure on his rule. There was a time where Umar ibn Abdul-Aziz, he was looking for people to give jizya to give the zakat to, and jizya. He was trying to find poor people in the khilafah, and he couldn't find anyone. To the point where he went to the minbar in Syria, in Damascus, and he literally makes an announcement. If anyone can find, literally anyone in any province who needs help with money, like they need the jizya and they need the zakah funds that we've collected, tell us and we'll give you 500 dirhams, which is a decent amount of money. Nobody collected it because they couldn't find anyone. His reforms and his amazing leadership literally eliminated poverty. And by the way, you have to understand, when we talk about giving jizya and zakah, the first people to receive it are Muslims. They couldn't find anyone from the Muslims. They went to the non-Muslims, they couldn't find anyone. This is the justice he ruled by. This is how he ruled with Islam, as opposed to some of the Umayyad governors who did rule by Islam for the most part, but they had some serious issues. Okay, so Umar was very, very special as a patron of scholarship. I'll go through this very quickly. I wish I could mention a million things, but we're going to suffice it with this one thing. I was going to mention like 3 other things related to this. When Umar became Khalifa, one of the first things he does is, and you have to understand, Umar is also a scholar. He starts writing to his scholar friends. He writes to people like Az-Zuhri in Medina, the scholar I mentioned. He writes to people like Abu Bakr ibn Hazm. He writes to people, anyways, he writes to a bunch of scholars. And he tells them, whatever hadith you have, write it down. Okay? فَإِنِّي خِفْتُ دُرُوسَ الْعِلْمِ. You know, when I was first learning Arabic and I was reading the sentence, I had durus means erasure. Okay, it means like vanishing, erasing of something. It also means lessons. Okay, so when I read this, I'm like, why is Umar ibn Abdul-Aziz scared of the lessons of knowledge? Like, why is he scared of learning? But no, it means erasing. Okay, he was afraid that knowledge is going to be wiped out. So he actually wrote this, and what this spawned is a mass writing of hadith from scholars. You see suddenly people like Imam Malik writing his Muwatta. You see people even before him, Az-Zuhri was one of the first people to actually write down hadith in a public collection. Not a public collection, but in a collection where other people can narrate from him. You see mass amount of people writing hadith. If you want to look at the legacy today of Umar, take a look at the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Take a look at Bukhari Sahih, Muslim Sahih, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, Abdul Razak. Keep listing the books of hadith. The source of this is the fact that Umar made that call. Start writing down the hadith. Because before then, you have to understand, not a lot of people wrote down hadith. It wasn't common. The Sahaba used to have private collections, really small treatises. Some of them are like not a lot, but some of them are preserved. Abdullah ibn Umar, he has a treatise written on hadith, it's preserved. We have it. But it's very uncommon. After him, people start writing it. And because of his order, alhamdulillah, we have the words of Rasulullah preserved with us today. So this is like sadaqah jariyah to another level. Okay? And to be honest, this is sufficient. I'm just mentioning his patronage to scholarship, his taqwa. This, I can't do justice to this. Why are you shining a light? Oh yeah? Okay. uh, his taqwa is something we can't begin to discuss. We can begin to discuss it, actually, we can't end to discuss it. It's very hard to end. One of the things that he was known for is during his khutbahs, he was constantly reminding people about death. This is what he was known for. People would attend his khutbahs and there wouldn't be a dry eye, including his own. Because he was so passionate giving these khutbahs, he would cry profusely. Like this is what, and subhanAllah, like again, the parallelism with his grandfather, great grandfather. Like the same thing. If you were to see them, it would be almost like seeing the same people. SubhanAllah. But I want to mention one thing. And again, I've chosen this very carefully. Anas bin Malik, radiallahu anh, he says that after the Rasulullah, we've never prayed in a way as like sweet, in a way that resembles the Rasulullah, like we did with Umar. Basically saying that Ibn Abdul Aziz, his prayer was very similar to Rasulullah in terms of khushu'. First of all, the statement alone is big. The statement alone is very big. Anas bin Malik prayed behind Abu Bakr, he prayed behind Umar, he prayed behind Uthman, he prayed behind Ali, he prayed behind Hassan, he prayed behind the Rasulullah as well, so he knows. He prayed behind all these people, and he's saying that the one that resembles the Rasul's prayer the most is Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Okay, the one mentioning this is also, as I mentioned, a Sahabi, Anas bin Malik. You have to understand, like, Anas bin Malik he dies in 93 Hijri, okay? Ibn Abdul Aziz is born in 63 Hijri, okay? Anas bin Malik is, when he meets Ibn Abdul Aziz, he's seeing like a kid. He's not seeing somebody like very big. And there's a massive age gap between them, okay? He's looking at a kid or a young adult when he's praying behind him and saying, this guy's prayer is like the Rasul's prayer. From a Sahabi, that's massive praise, especially from Anas bin Malik. You guys know what Anas bin Malik is known for? Like, why is he famous? Do I allow you to guess or should I spoil it? There's one reason, come on. Hadith. Well, why are you shaking your head? Oh, you didn't say it too bad. Hadith. Anas bin Malik was somebody who spent a lot of time with the Rasul. He knows the Rasul very well. He was literally a servant for the Rasul. His mother told him, like, go serve the Rasul. Anas bin Malik knows what he's talking about. He's narrated a lot of hadith. So when he says his prayer is like the Rasul's, we take it serious. Okay? Now let's finally talk about the thing that we will obviously end with, his death. From like what I've told you so far, what's your impression of him? Good or bad? If you anyway say bad, I'm not going to kill you, but something close to that. Good. Okay. Well, you're representing everyone. Good. Of course it's good. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed with that. Who do you think disagreed? Huh? Oh, forget. Screw the Orientals. You guys will. Random, like, old white people. Fine. Screw them. Like, from his time. Yeah. I don't know who's speaking. Who is speaking? Yes, the rest of the Umayyads. The Umayyad ruling elite. They didn't like the reforms. They didn't like the fact that they had to give away all the Ummah's wealth that they stole back. They didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that he reduced taxes, so the next Khalifa may have to, keep that up. Otherwise, you may see rebellions, which did happen. Rebellions did happen. They didn't like what he did. They didn't like pretty much anything. They hated the fact that he reduced taxes. They hated the fact that he made them adopt a simpler life. So what did they do? One of the Umayyads, he hired a slave to poison Umar. SubhanAllah, like this is like, we see it, a lot of the times we see a good leader, we kill him ourselves. The Ummah kills him, SubhanAllah. He poisons Umar. Umar finds out who this person is and he calls him. Okay, he calls the slave, he's like, why'd you do this? Again, like I just realized it's the parallelism with his great-grandfather. Like you would expect Umar to be like, take the sword and like, boom. Suddenly his head is not part of his body anymore, right? But he doesn't do that. He goes and just sincerely asks him, like, why would you do this? And the slave literally responds by saying, I was paid. I was bribed. So he did it. And he ends up dying because of the illness that this poison causes him. And ultimately, that's it. Like the amazing things that happened with the Umayyads cease. After his rule, you see even more tension, you see even more issues come up. Okay. Now, you can reflect on his legacy, but I guess let me mention one more thing, just mentioning his legacy myself. We started with this talk mentioning the hadith of Tajdeed, or the hadith of the Mujaddid. Yes? And I mentioned that as a Mujaddid, he was very unique. That his Tajdeed was not just in one area of scholarship or in politics, it was both. You saw that in politics, the reforms he made to the point where you would not find a single person in Muslim lands who needed zakah or jizya money. You saw his legacy in scholarship by the fact that if you go to a bookstore and you see all the collections of hadith, he's to credit for that. As a mujaddid, he was unique. Now the reason we're having these talks so you understand and know him. It's a good thing to have role models. And more importantly, it's a good, not more importantly, but also importantly, it's a good thing to know who's passing this legacy down to you. Because you're not inheriting this deen from your parents. Who cares? You're inheriting this deen from people like Ibn Abd al-Aziz, who's passing it down to the next generation until that torch comes to you. If you're truly God-fearing, you're going to have that torch, you're going to hold it high, let its light shine everywhere, and let everyone feel its warmth, even if they don't like the warmth. If you're a coward, and maybe even a munafiq, what you're going to do is going to try to hide yourself. You're going to try to, or maybe even box it in somewhere. Meaning keep Islam for one aspect of life and remove it from every other aspect. So you have two choices ahead of you, and it's up to you which one you're going to choose. You saw that one of your righteous predecessors, he made his choice. Everyone literally felt the warmth of Islam during his rule. Everyone felt the warmth of just rule under him. And we ask Allah Azza wa Jalla that when he's raised on Yawm al-Qiyamah, he's raised under his shade. Because he was definitely a just ruler. He's deserving of that. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ الْأَمِينِ وَعَلَى آلِهِ وَصَحْبِهِ أَجْمَعِينَ. Any questions? Yes. So some of it was definitely wrong. The Umayyad money came a lot from the Ummah's wealth. So that's why he gave a lot of it back when he became Caliph. Okay. The emphasis was to show his change. Because the thing is, look, like he's a human being. He had issues. Like he lived like how the Umayyads lived. When he became the Khalifa and he became started becoming really cognizant of this responsibility, he gave it up, which is really what's praiseworthy from him, right? And he gave up more than what he took. Basically. That make sense? Yes. Wait, this one? Is it not working? Oh, they didn't hear. Okay. She was asking why emphasize the fact that he had a lavish life before and then left it. My response was what you heard. Yes, that was your question. Any other question? Assalamu alaikum. Allah, see you guys next week, inshallah. When we're discussing who? Who are we discussing? Yeah, you guys are very slow.